Oh, I've been wanting to watch this though.
How do you make an open world where the player is completely free to explore, but is also led towards key locations
I'm grabbing some
that
more
will
snacks
advance
for
the
food,
story?
BRB.
This
Apparently
was
this is a
the
really good
biggest
video.
challenge that Nintendo faced.
This is also why I genuinely think the open world in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is god tier.
When making their very first open world game, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. They wanted to give players a sense of freedom and exploration not seen in the franchise since the very first Zelda game on NES. But they also wanted to make sure players were always making progress towards the overarching goal of saving Princess Zelda. This was no easy task to overcome. Nintendo had to go through false starts and bad playtests before finally arriving at the game we all know today. The one that made us rethink how exploration can work in an open world game. And Nintendo actually shared their experience of this difficult development process at the Computer Entertainment Developers Conference in Japan back in 2017. It was a really interesting lecture and a rare act of Nintendo openly discussing the nitty-gritty details of their game design and development. But that information is sadly very hard to access today. The lecture was never uploaded. All of the reports are in Japanese, and the only English translation is a tweet thread summary that's been mangled by Twitter. And Nintendo actually got journalists to pull down their photos of the original slides. So, I thought it was time to right that wrong. To mark the imminent release of the next Zelda game, Tears of the Kingdom, I decided to resurrect that old talk. I gathered different write-ups of the talk and had them translated into English. I used internet archives to rediscover the lost slides, and used motion graphics to make them come alive. And I used AI upscaling to bring back old screenshots. So, without further ado, I'm Mark Brown, this is a GMTK Mini, and here's how Nintendo solved the biggest problem in Breath of the Wild's design.
Wait, that's actually sick.
Okay, so Nintendo had built a humongous world map for Hyrule, and let players explore in any direction. But they needed to find some way to lure players towards key locations. The initial idea was to use a system of points and lines. The points are the Sheikah Towers, those giant, neon-lit spires that soar above the ground. They're clearly visible from a great distance, and they confer a great benefit to the player. They reveal a massive chunk of your map when you get to the top. So these 15 or so towers would be obvious waypoints for the player, which should effectively lead them around the map. The lines are the routes and roads between the towers, and so Nintendo could place various events along those lines. As players walked towards the towers, they would discover characters, enemy camps, and other goodies as they went. But this idea completely flopped. The guidance worked, but it actually worked too well. Playtesters felt they were stuck on a linear path and forced to follow the towers. Many complained about being trapped on an invisible but obvious guide rope, and those who deviated from the line would just get lost or find little of interest to explore. And the data bore this out. Nintendo tracked the playtesters' movements and created a heat map to see where players had explored.
This is the kind of research I would do. This is the kind of development research I did, by the way. And this is sick that they actually did heat mapping of player movement. This is some of the crazy shit that game researchers now do. This is, for people who want to know, this is games user research. We do, they do crazy behind the scenes work to help inform design.
Explored, and they discovered that players were split into two completely different groups, about 80%, and they discovered that players were split into.
Fun fact, I literally have heat maps that we generated for League of Legends to help when we ran into an issue where there's an issue that happened in League of Legends where you have this like kind of Goldilocks zone of what's the right amount of ganks. Ganks from a jungler, right? Or the jungler comes into the lanes, right? You don't want laning phase to just be so stagnant where it's just pure laning, because rarely, like, kills then tend to not happen. You also don't want junglers just being able to absolutely live in the lanes, because then that pisses people off and they're 1v1 or they're 2v2. So there's this Goldilocks zone of appropriate ganks that you want to see. And one of the ways we have measured that was we literally did heat mapping of jungler movement throughout Summoner's Rift to basically see how much time are they in lane versus out of lane. how much they're ganking. It was basically charting movement of junglers. So
into 2 completely different groups. About 80% dutifully followed the main route from tower to tower, and the other 20% just sorta randomly wandered around. Neither playstyle was close to what Nintendo was after. So they decided to go for a different approach. Instead of nudging players to always travel towards Sheikah Towers, they could get players to move around the map by luring them towards a larger variety of landmarks and points of interest. Things
Sheikah
like
shrines. Yep.
stables, and enemy encampments. They just needed to find ways to make players gravitate towards these places like moths flapping towards a flame. So they first made sure that each area would confer obvious benefits. Completing shrines lets you increase your health or stamina. Enemy bases are filled with weapons to pick up. And while stables were initially just for registering horses, Nintendo made them much more attractive by adding beds for healing, a shop, and NPCs who would hand out rumors and side quests. Other areas would be worth visiting for the resources contained within. Nintendo purposefully got rid of simple healing items like hearts, so players would have to go into forests to get mushrooms or find animals to hunt. And
the other thing is, like, I think the thing that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom does so well is that it's like big thing, slightly smaller thing, even smaller thing, and that you're always getting gravitated towards them. For instance, last night we can even use my play as an example of this. We're trying to go to Gerudo Valley, right? We're on the road to Gerudo Valley. I got sidetracked. The rocks fell out of the sky. We're like, oh, cool, rocks are falling out of the sky. Let's go investigate that. We investigate that. Cool, that was a visual moment. That was a really small thing. But the best example of this is the Sheikah Shrine that pulled me off course. I went to the Sheikah Shrine, and now that we've exited the Sheikah Shrine, I even remember this because I thought about how to fix the puzzle, and I know how to do the puzzle. Right outside of the shrine is a little puzzle where I'm going to have to stick 2 pegs into a rock and then put a platform on them to open the chest. To my left is the guy who has his sign that I need to figure out a way to hold his sign up. So now there's these smaller micro things within there. And then all of that is set in the context. I even know this. I have it mapped in my memory just from last night. Is set in the context of a bigger abandoned ruined castle and like ruins that are just kind of cool and ambient. And I think that's I wonder if they get to that, but that's the beautiful part of this game is that they slowly direct you, and then all of a sudden you're in this ruined castle. There's an old rusty sword somewhere that you pick up. There's a hidden treasure chest, and all you can help think is, damn, this is so fucking aesthetic.
Forests to get mushrooms or find animals to hunt. And they made rupees extremely rare, so players would need to go towards mountains and quarries to mine valuable ore, which can be sold to shopkeepers. For this plan to work, they would need to make other adjustments too. You see, the Sheikah Towers are enormous and easy to see. The smaller landmarks, less so. So Nintendo had to make them stick out from a distance or from a high-up vantage point. Shrines were given a distinctive, lit-up look.
Glow.
Campfires give off a tall tower of smoke. Enemy bases are often built around massive skull-shaped rocks, and the stable is a gigantic wooden statue of a horse. Also, while there's usually only 1 or 2 Sheikah Towers on screen at once, there could be dozens of other, smaller landmarks nearby, and that many options can be completely overwhelming in an open-world game.
Sure, you can say that a lot of other games have done this, but this is saying how Nintendo solved the problem that they had with Zelda in particular. And again, I think Zelda in particular does this better than so many other games. And we'll see if they get to it, but I'm curious if they get into why Zelda's open world feels so fucking good relative to the rest. Otherwise, I'll fucking just make a little video on it after reacting to this.
And that was partly the reason behind Nintendo creating the triangle rule. You see, Nintendo designed the terrain and landscape of Hyrule to be mostly made up of triangles. It's all hills, mountains, and rock formations that are shaped like pyramids and cones. And this has various benefits for the world design. Like whenever you face a giant mountain, players get to decide whether to scale it or go around.
Or the other thing they do really well is they create a lot of valleys. They create a lot of really obvious valleys, like, oh, I'm going through here, and it guides you to the next section.
Creating decision-making during exploration. Also, the player's eye is naturally guided to the tip of the triangle, so you can place points of interest at the peak to draw the player closer. But most importantly, these triangles simply block whatever's behind, meaning that the player is rarely overwhelmed by a massive field of things to do.
Oh,
There's usually
that's
only
another...
a couple attractive places on screen, and the rest
That's
is hidden
actually a
behind
really good
hills
point. I didn't
and
even think about
mountains.
that.
But as you go towards these mountains, whatever's behind is gradually revealed. Whether you climb the hill or try to move alongside it, more terrain will start to be shown.
I still think my point stands on their triangles. They do a really good job of sometimes like, and maybe it's a thing. It's like big things will be obscured, and then there's a peak, like a valley within triangles that will then show one thing. You're like, oh, I'm gonna go towards that.
And this has an interesting outcome. It creates a constant source of surprise and curiosity as new locations make themselves known. So you might be going towards one landmark, but as you travel there, 2 or 3 new places are revealed. Perhaps a shrine on the horizon, or an enemy camp around a corner, or a distinctive looking rock, or a curious sight at the peak of a mountain. Wherever you go, and whatever you do, you'll be given a few new things to catch your eye and attract you. Perhaps that new landmark will distract you, and you'll ditch your old plan and go somewhere new instead. When you're finished, you'll remember where you were supposed to go and head back there, only to be distracted again. Whatever the case, this creates a chain reaction, an infinite loop of discoveries.
I do think if there was one major critique of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom that I've heard, well, I actually don't know if it's as true for Tears of the Kingdom, but certainly for Breath of the Wild, and I'd be curious as a designer what I would do. I would be really interested to see how many people played Breath of the Wild but didn't finish it. I have heard so many stories of people who tried the game but didn't finish. And I do think in terms of in fact, I'm curious, chat, how many of you played but didn't finish? Yeah, didn't finish but 300 plus hours. I don't even know if that's necessarily a bad thing. Because if you didn't finish the game, but you still, think about it this way. What if you don't finish Legend of Zelda, but you still really enjoyed playing it and you put 300 hours in it? It was still super worthwhile. I've started the game 3 times. They get past 4 hours each time. Like, you know, there's something even to be said that like maybe if you don't finish it, it's actually okay, because what I also hear a lot is people rarely, they'll play it, they don't finish, but they're like, yeah, I sunk so many fucking hours into it. I would love Nintendo's data on how many people actually finished the game, because I do think in this balance they had of letting people explore and go do all this stuff and content versus, hey, complete the game. I think they maybe had, like, I would argue they might have either had too much stuff, or they just might not have, in the era of like linearly do this, beat the game, or fucking open world, do whatever the fuck you want. They might have like they might have gone a little bit more towards that direction. And it's not that they need less stuff to do. It's like they might have just needed more nudges for players to complete the main game, especially like if they were coming back into the game or stuff like that. I mean, and you know what? Someone in chat made a really good point. They said, Blau, what do you qualify as didn't finish? Because I play it and I finished what I wanted to do, but I don't really consider Ganon to be finished. I'm Breath of the Wild and possibly even Tears of the Kingdom get into this weird place where they are almost, with how much hours people sink into them, because my original Breath of the Wild playthrough I had hundreds of hours in. It's gone. It was on a different Switch. They're almost like, there's almost an element of like Animal Crossing or like even Minecraft or other sort of like just pure sim game. There's a lot of sim gameplay involved, to the point where it's like, are you actually beating this game for, you know, the story is one way to beat the game, but another way to really beat the game or just play the game is just to have enjoyed and played a fuck ton of the game and done your own little thing. Kind of as a choose your own adventure. That's a good point. Some people are like, what if I didn't save Zelda or didn't fight Ganon? What if, for me, Legend of Zelda was doing new combat stuff, finding all of the Koroks, was, you know, and in that way, that speaks to the game being much more than just a open world story game, but a game that gave players so many options and ways to express creativity. There's probably a lot of people that don't even focus on combat. They just want to focus on all the Sheikah shrines and do puzzles. Probably people that just want to go around and like cook and find new recipes. I think that actually speaks a lot about the game. I actually think a more compelling argument to me is that if someone spent a fuck ton of time in Zelda and never beat the game, but found things in the game that they really love and have a really fond experience of the game, I think that's a success. I don't think you needed to beat the game for the game to be worthwhile to you and for it to not just be an incredibly beautiful game.
A breadcrumb trail of landmarks, all of which makes you slowly move across the map in an addictive quest of, ooh, what's that? Ooh, what's that? Ooh, what's that?
Know that feeling.
And before you know it, you're at a Sheikah Tower, which is exactly where Nintendo wanted you to go in the first place. So now, with this system of attractive landmarks, players still went from point to point, but this time, instead of following a specific line, they were simply following a breadcrumb trail of interesting landmarks.
Yes.
A trail that would eventually lead players to Breath of the Wild's most important locales. And where following the towers made players feel like they were being forced to travel in a specific way, the littered landmark approach was much more organic and player-driven. Players would naturally pick places to go based on their own curiosity and depending on their current goal or mood.
We'll talk about this a little bit, but this is another interesting thing about why I think Legend of Zelda is the best open world game. And people will say Skyrim, whatever, and people can argue for any number of other games. So I'll always defend Breath of the Wild and now Tears of the Kingdom as the best open world games. And I don't think they're going to cover it in this lecture or in this video, but I'll explain it in my own afterwards. By the way, I do actually think Hogwarts Legacy did a really good job of what I'm about to talk about.
Might be more
Shadow of Colossus, no, not even close. None of these games are even close.
Or less attractive based on what you need. If you're looking to increase power, then shrines and enemy camps suddenly become much more attractive than stables and towers. Then, when night falls, other locations become more visible and appealing. So players no longer felt forced to follow a certain landmark or goal, but they still ended up where they needed to go. And Nintendo could clearly see this improvement on the heat map. There was no longer that awkward 80-20 split in the experiences. Instead, all players fell into Nintendo's vision for the game. They could see that players freely explored various places, following their curiosity from landmark to landmark, but almost all players eventually got to the key locations. And I totally found this when playing.
I'll talk about Genshin. Genshin very much tried to and in a lot of ways succeeded, and that's why Genshin's still very successful, but there's a really important part.
Breath of the Wild
they haven't covered it here.
I never felt particularly guided or led around the world. I was just following my own curiosity and exploring on my own terms, but I still ended up stumbling into important locations and was always making progress through the story. So this was Nintendo's first proper open world game, and the team clearly had a lot to learn. In the second half of the talk, Nintendo explained that to get a sense of scale and density, they initially used data from Google Maps to have Link run around Nintendo's hometown of Kyoto and clamber up Japan's famous Himeji Castle. And they shared how they had to make all new tools to allow for a large team to collaborate on a single map. But through clever design, driven by a desire to create a specific experience for the player, it solved the biggest problem in Breath of the Wild's design. Nintendo created an open-world game that beautifully balances guidance and exploration. A feeling of free-form adventure that I've only really seen since in Elden Ring, and almost certainly we'll see in Tears of
Elden Ring, I think,
is forward to jumping in later this week.
Elden Ring is close, and so I think if I'm to then offer kind of a unique insight from my perspective as a dev, I feel like that video was incredible, touch on Nintendo's talk, but maybe doesn't touch on the sort of final reason for why Breath of the Wild and possibly Tears of the Kingdom are, in my mind, the best open world games. And here's what it really is. It was that last part when I was describing the little journey I had last night. It's the last part that is what makes it so good. And that last part is atmosphere. The atmosphere in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is unmatched. There's nothing that can compete with that atmosphere. It is now Things like, to be fair, the atmosphere and what is trying to be accomplished in other games is also just less broadly appealing. So the atmosphere in things like Skyrim or Elden Ring or any number of other games are definitely going to be more grim, more dark. You could even go back to like Ocarina of Time as being just like a much more like kind of depressing game. Look at the atmosphere of like Animal Crossing, and like that was a similar vibe. Like Animal Crossing's atmosphere is much closer to the Legend of Zelda's atmosphere than the Legend of Zelda's atmosphere is to Elden Ring. It's like, oh my God, the world is ending. There's that, you know, even if the backstory is like, oh my God, like there's a calamity. There's, you know, the prince has been trapped for 100. Like you can like say the things that are happening. You've been asleep for 100 years. The castle is in danger. The princess is gone. Like, oh my God, people are there. People are being attacked by monsters and monsters. You can say it. The actual atmosphere of the game never conveys that. The atmosphere of the game is for the most part very relaxing. It's very calming, and I think that obviously, you know, the atmosphere of Elden Ring was never going to try to be that, right? Or Skyrim. They're never trying to be that, and they do a great job. But I think it's why Breath of the Wild, it's almost in sort of the stylistic and artistic choices they made and how to present the game, made it just so broadly appealing to so many people. And it's a reason why when you go on YouTube, there's a million fucking playlists of like ambient noises from Breath of the Wild, ambient music from Breath of the Wild. We talked about this previously, but even the music in Breath of the Wild, it's never where there's just no music and you're just kind of alone in your thoughts, but it's never that the music is overpowering. It's soft, subtle bits of music that play as you're exploring the open world. And obviously, when you're in a more sort of intense gameplay moment in a dungeon, there's consistent music. In a boss fight, there's epic, you know, thrilling music going on. But throughout the, you know, open world part, it's very subtle how they do the music. And that's also how they do the environment too. Let's talk about the one thing that we just did last night, Chad, which I'm trying to go towards a main quest, towards the Gerudo Valley. I get drawn off by a Sheikah shrine, come out of it, and there's two little puzzles right by me that I can go solve. And those two little puzzles are also part of this beautifully, you know, decrepit, broken down old castle. And God, it's just that aesthetic that they created of these old rocks, this old broken down castle with moss growing on the rocks, and there's little fireflies around at night, is everything. The way they have conveyed the atmosphere of this game, whether it's the soft, subtle details of little birds flying around in parts, graphically, just the way, like, God, that is why when someone critiques, it's like, oh, like it's kid graphics, or it's like, oh, it's 30 FPS. I'm like, I don't care. I don't care. Someone in chat even said this, and this sort of explains why it's such an incredible open world game, almost like you're playing Animal Crossing in some degree, or like a lifestyle sim game. You could get blazed out of your mind and be high, or just be, you know, messing around. You can go into Legend of Zelda and just enjoy exploring and doing whatever. You don't have to accomplish anything. You don't have to unlock a new Sheikah shrine. You don't have to go and beat this mission, beat this boss. You can just go around. I'm just going to go collect some food today and just mess around. And that is what makes it the perfect open world game. It's the idea that you can just go around and do whatever you want. And the game itself has created, you know, it's everything links it together. It's the perfect game to make you want to go off and explore and do fun things because it's so relaxing and calming to go do so. And that is my take on Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom and why I think they are the best open world games.